I'm Dr. Tim McGrew. I'm a Christian philosopher, and I enjoy building connections with people at Atheist Edge.
Speculation is dangerously non-evidential by its very definition, reasoning based on inconclusive evidence, conjecture, or supposition.
Wallace spends the entire book dancing around the inconclusive evidence, or circumstantial evidence surrounding the resurrection, and he does a thing that a lot of apologists do, where he takes in all these people and places that we can confirm with archaeology and with history, and he says, how else do you explain all this stuff? And it's great that archaeologists have found things like the Pool of Siloam, that they've verified that Herod existed, that we know that Pontius Pilate was a real person, but that doesn't actually address the resurrection itself. It just makes it, at best, historical fiction. He doesn't really have anything that affirms that a supernatural event took place, but if you try and tell him that, then he's just going to say you're biased against the supernatural.
It sounds to me a lot like an argument from incredulity. Like, you hear Christians saying, I don't know, you never see scientists put chemicals in a test tube and then something crawl out of the test tube. You can't explain that, therefore it's got to be this. Just because I don't know how something works, you can't automatically go to the most fantastical explanation.
Sure, and it's almost as if Wallace is as biased for the supernatural as he claims we are biased against the supernatural. And hopefully that's not how he started the process, because that would not invalidate his claims, but if you're going into an investigation with a bias that you don't account for, then it's going to skew your results.
This proposal, that one or two disciples had a vision of the risen Christ and convinced the others, may begin to explain the transformation of the apostles, but it fails to explain the empty tomb and offers an explanation of the resurrection observations that is inconsistent with the biblical record. Why do apologists keep demanding that we explain parts of Bible stories? This is like saying, a TIE fighter collision may explain Darth Vader's disappearance, but it doesn't explain the destruction of the Death Star. Well, guess what? I don't believe in TIE fighters, Death Stars, Darth Vader, or anything else from those movies. Just like I don't believe in the transformation of the apostles, the empty tomb, or anything else from Bible stories. I mean, this whole argument is dumb on the face of it. If you want to come to the table expecting me to assume the Bible's true, then why not just cut to the chase and expect me to believe the part where it said Jesus rose from the dead? This whole business of arguing for one part of a story based on deductions from another part just feels like a shell game meant to increase the confidence of believers who don't really notice what you're doing.
So Wallace employs the minimal facts approach to explain the resurrection, where he doesn't take the whole of Scripture, he just takes the 4 or so maybe key points that he says most scholars agree on, and he asks, well, how do you explain these 4 points? Just these 4 points without going to the resurrection. And the issue he has when he tries to rebut the common skeptical explanations, like things like swoon theory, or things like the disciples had hallucinations, or maybe 1 or 2 of them had hallucinations, is that he thinks that just because he has an idea that explains all 4 of the facts in the resurrection, that he thinks any other explanation must also explain those 4 points by one single explanation, when really that's not the case. If you can show those 4 points have natural explanations, even if they're individual explanations, then you've still shown that you can account for these points without invoking the supernatural. Like in this particular case, he's talking about the change that took place in the disciples post-resurrection and the experience that they allegedly had with the risen Savior. And he says, well, okay, you can account for this with grief hallucinations, which are common, but that doesn't also explain the empty tomb. Well, it doesn't have to. The empty tomb can have other explanations. Swoon theory, maybe Joseph didn't bury the body where he said he buried it. There's other ways you can explain the empty tomb, and you can explain the visions separately from that and still have neither of them be supernatural.
When I read this portion of it, I was thinking about, this is a good time to plug your blog, Sleeping In Sundays. It's on your screen right now. But Chris does a blog here, and before we started this book project, you did a 2-part blog series on minimal facts. And I was thinking when I read this that this is probably the part of the book that really started to get your hair in a dander. I don't know.
We're going to get there very soon,
Yeah.
but this obviously, like I said, I just did a whole blog post of that, which you can go at sleepinginsundays.com, plug. But I don't think he's being disingenuous. I just think he's employing a bad apologetic that sounds good to him, but doesn't sound good once you think about it a little bit.
Hey everyone, Luciano's Logic is here once again. On page 50 of Cold Case Christianity, J. Warner Wallace writes, "If we simply enter into the investigation without a pre-existing bias against anything supernatural, the final explanation accounts for all of the evidence without any difficulty. The final explanation accounts for the evidence most simply and most exhaustively, and it is logically consistent if we simply allow for the existence of God in the first place. The final explanation is also superior to the other accounts, given that it does not suffer from all of the problems we see with other explanations." This is true in theory. However, if you fully examine an idea, if you fully examine all the evidence, you won't need to have a lack of a pre-existing bias against a supernatural explanation if whatever thing you are examining is actually supernaturally caused, and there's evidence that shows that. And the reality is, in a lot of cases, if something is supernaturally caused, it'd be difficult to explain or clearly define what evidence for that being supernaturally caused would look like in the first place. That's only one of the multitude of issues that this sort of explanation would have for anything.
Part of the problem with supernatural explanations is that they're always exhaustive explanations because they are created ad hoc to explain an unknown phenomenon. Like not to be condescending, but the tooth fairy, for example, perfectly explains where your teeth go after you lose them and how they get replaced by money, at least until you find out that your parents have done it. And so I don't know if there's someone out there who is a tooth fairy apologist because they never found out that it was their parents the whole time, and that they have, well, the tooth fairy explains it all, so what else do I even need? Why would I investigate it further when I already have a perfectly serviceable explanation for it?
That claim is equally plausible in my opinion. The only difference is this one is a recurring event, an alleged recurring event. It's not something that happened 2,000 years ago. It's not a historical event. It's something we could test in present time.
Yeah, but think about it. I mean, when you want to hypothesize an all-powerful, timeless, all-knowing being, that being can serve as an explanation for literally anything. So it's like simultaneously a very useful and completely useless explanation, just because it's so overly broad. And like we said before, everything, he's like the default for believers until once again we find a actual natural explanation for how stuff works, and that's where God the Gaps comes in.
Nearly 25 years after the murder, we simply exhausted our leads in the case and found ourselves without any viable options. It was time to suspect the case once again.
Okay, so this is where Wallace
Okay,
really
this is where-
started to
I knew
get
I
my
was
goat.
close.
Yeah, like I said, it was so soon into the book. It was like
Yep.
10% of the way,
Yep.
according to Kindle. But this is chapter 2, and this is the first part where he's really trying to connect how homicide investigations work towards how investigations into Jesus' death and resurrection work. And when he talks about homicides, he says specifically, when we're investigating homicides, there are 4 categories of cause of death that we look for. We look for natural death, accidental death, suicide, homicide. That's it. He does not say supernatural death is an option. And yet, when we go to the resurrection, he brings in supernatural resurrection as one of the options. So that's a problem. That's an inconsistency.
But he's got a website. He's got a book now. He's so heavily invested in this. He's heard all the criticisms and all. He's heard all the rebuttals. And even if some had to have rung true in his head, and he has to understand that he's touting this as I'm employing the same methods as I would as a criminal investigator. But then he goes just off the rails immediately, and he doesn't. He might as well not even be a criminal investigator. He just uses that as a selling point because he's got this niche audience now, and he's doubled down on it, and he's past the point of no return. He can't go back, even if something, hit him upside the head that caused him to say, okay, he's not going to scrap this effort. Nothing we could say or do he's going to continue to double down.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope that's not the case. I don't want to assume that someone is being just such a cynical marketer that they're going to just spout the same nonsense that's been debunked already. I mean, we know people do that. I hope Wallace isn't one of them. I hope he sincerely believes, even though I think he's incorrect, I hope he's at least sincere and not just trying to sell books. But it's stuff like this that's so obvious to me, so obvious to you, I can't imagine that he hasn't come across it before and had to reckon with it at some point. Let's say we have a case where you have a certain amount of evidence, but it's not conclusive evidence, and it's not enough to determine cause of death fitting into one of these 4 categories. Wallace doesn't go from there and say, maybe it was ghosts, maybe it was the god of bullets that transported that slug into his cranium. He doesn't go
I remember
there.
that, yeah.
This is where cold cases come from. The places where you don't have explanations. He doesn't suspend the case once he's exhausted all natural explanations. So when Wallace runs out of natural explanations for a death, he suspends the case. But he doesn't do that when it comes to Jesus. He doesn't say, okay, we don't have enough evidence to conclude what happened 2,000 years ago.
He goes ad hoc
instead. He goes that next level to a supernatural explanation, which once again is above and beyond what he's going to do in his day-to-day work.
He did exactly what he says he never does in any homicide investigation. He'll just suspend the case. He won't make an ad hoc. He won't just close the case or he won't come to a hasty conclusion. He'll always leave it open if it's not definitive.
And you're allowed to do that when it comes to the resurrection. You can be an agnostic. That's at least intellectually honest. You don't need to have an answer to everything. You're allowed to say, I don't know, and maybe I'm just not going to find out in my lifetime. I'm going to do the best I can with the information I have. If new information comes in, then I'll deal with it at that point. But until then, I'm not going to say I know something that I simply don't know.
In my day-to-day life, I think I speak for a good chunk, if not all, of the atheist community. We live our life as though there is no God, but it doesn't mean that we're not holding out. I personally am holding out for more evidence. It may never come, and I'm not anxiously awaiting it, thinking that it's probably there. I don't have God and Jesus in my heart.
Yeah, and you and I mean, we're talking with Christians all the time just because we're hobbyists on this stuff. And, if they find Jesus' diary from 30 AD, where he's like, "Welp, off to die tomorrow. Wish me luck."
I would be embarrassed.
Then we'll have to. But then we'll deal with that at that point.
I would be embarrassed as hell.
Probably.
Well, yeah. The whole reason I go to the book club. I guess maybe some non-believers engage with believers because they're just natural contrarians and they just love the fight. I don't love the fight. I'm there seeking truths. I've admitted I was wrong on several things. Just 3 major issues in just the last year. Yeah, I would, if it turns out we're just completely wrong, I would not double down. I would accept it. I'd be embarrassed as shit, but, I don't have an empire, a book and website and marketing empire with a bestseller. It'd be easier for me to just, all I have to do is take the letter A off the name of this channel.
It would be awesome for you. You could go to churches and speak.
Oh,
you know
totally.
how much these people with great testimonials, they can go around, they can make that circuit. There is way more money in theism than atheism.
And unlike Dr. Ordway, no one would accuse me of having never been an atheist. There would be no chance of that.
You have how many years worth of videos now?
Almost 2. We're like over 200 videos. Plus, I've never been a believer. I was never, I've called myself an agnostic. I've identified as an agnostic from age 8 and identified as a atheist since age 15. So I don't even know what it's like to believe. It would be a whole new experience. It would be embarrassing. It would be a shock. I would have to unlearn everything I've ever thought to be true. And like I said, I'd have to take the letter A off of the name of this channel. I would still be doing YouTube videos. It would just be the exact opposite.
Hello everyone, once again Luciano's Logic is here to read and chat with you guys. On page 64 of Cold Case Christianity, author J. Warner Wallace writes, "We understand that it's never morally right to lie, steal, or kill for the mere fun of it. These moral laws are transcendent and objective. Their truth is not a matter of subjective opinion." And you see, J. Warner Wallace, if that were all you were saying, I would disagree with parts of it, but for the most part, I'd say that, yeah, those are pretty solid morals that people probably shouldn't argue with. You see, the problem is that lots of people who have J. Warner Wallace's particular belief system often say that these moral laws aren't just things that are written in our hearts when they're for fun, but also in other contexts, and that's where it's dangerous. Lots of people, lots of Christians have had to have conversations about whether or not they think it's moral for someone who was in, say, the Holocaust to lie to the Nazis. And you see, that's when things start to get problematic, and that's just one of the many critiques that people who criticize Christianity's moral system have with the morals that are espoused by the Bible.
In other words, there's absolute morality except when I need to do my job. Do you think it's okay to lie if it's for a good cause?
I hesitate to just automatically say, no, it's never okay. Because I can think of, extreme instances where lying would be overall beneficial.
But do you think a Christian who believes in the Bible and has one of the top 10 rules would be don't lie, do you think that there's a way that a Christian who's living biblically could justify lying in any circumstance?
No, I can't. It reminds me of Eusebius. He'll be on your screen right now, but I think he lived around 300-ish, maybe?
Something like that.
And he wrote some interesting things about lying for the Lord. He was one of the original lying for the Lord guys before the Mormons took on the idea, but he basically said, hey, if it furthers the Christian ideology, lie your ass off.
Jurors have a duty to take an unbiased look at witnesses and assume the best in them until they have a reason to do otherwise. Everybody knows the road to being unbiased and objective is just paved with assumptions. Specifically, assumptions about how infallible and honest people are in high stakes situations. Wasn't this guy a cop? He was a cop, right? Oh my goodness. I really find it difficult to affiliate unbiased with assume. You don't have a lot of assumptions when you're going into something to be unbiased and objective.
So according to Wallace's own criteria, if we do have a reason not to assume the best of a witness, like say if they traveled with the defendant for 3 years and were so convinced that he was the Son of God that they couldn't shut up about it, we should then stop giving the benefit of the doubt? Is that what he's saying?
That's kind of how I see it. Is that how you?
Yeah, I mean, he's trying to say that, towards the end of the book, he talks about were the disciples biased? Were the Gospels biased? Which, yes, absolutely they were biased. You have to account for that. If you're a historian, you account for that in your historical investigations.
They're not hostile witnesses, and they're not disinterested third parties.
Yeah, and that's why Wallace's qualifications don't do him any favors, because as a historian you have to reckon with questions like that and maybe acknowledge that, hey, maybe the sources we have aren't the greatest sources because the bias is just seeping through them. Whereas Wallace, he basically, at this point in his walk as a Christian, he's just taking the Gospels at face value, straight through. His entire apologetics is based on just reading the Bible as it is. He's not factoring bias into his reading at all.
You've brought up spectral evidence not admissible in court. There's a big 400-pound gorilla in the room right now that we haven't even mentioned yet. Mm-hmm. What else is not admissible in court that's huge here? Hearsay. Now, I get into this with the believers at the book club, or believers that I talk to from day to day. Mainstream scholarly consensus is not one book of the Bible, not one sentence in any book of the Bible was actually penned by someone who knew Jesus. That is important.
Yeah, I'm actually going to get into this a little bit later,
okay,
but it is a difference between history or historical investigation and homicide investigation, is that you can't have hearsay in a courtroom, but sometimes historically that's all you have. So once again, you have to account for that.
But if Wallace is treating this like an actual crime scene, he has to know that anyone he puts on the stand it's gonna be hearsay testimony. It's automatically not going to be admissible.
Well, let's not even talk hearsay. Let's talk about putting the defendant's best friend in the whole world on the stand. Do you think they're going to be a good character witness? Do you think you need to take into account that, hey, he's known this guy since age 8, they were in the military together, they went to college together, they were the best men at each other's weddings?
Not always, but yeah, that is a good point.
Do you think it's going to color his version of events at all?
Kavanaugh's roommate, I mean, I'm just saying there's certain circumstances, there's certain instances when they will give the honest testimony.
Or if you want to talk about, let's go even further with it. We talk about, or apologists talk about, criterion of embarrassment, or stuff like things that embarrass someone or go against what you would expect are more likely to be true. So what happens when someone says exactly what you would expect a follower of the Son of God to say?
Decreases its credibility.
Exactly. But you don't hear that side of things.
It's more credible that Jesus was even crucified in the first place, because he wasn't supposed to be. The actual Messiah, the Messiah, was supposed to be a warlord that was going to liberate Jerusalem from occupation. So when he died on the cross, that is, that to me, that's more credible.
Yeah, it sounds like a selective application depending on which specific aspect you're trying to argue about.
Right.
Atheist Edge. Walking the edge of what some consider offensive. But your feelings don't matter here. Only facts.
It was time to suspect the case once again.
We gotta leave that in there. That's gonna, that's gonna be in
You
the
want to leave it
outtakes,
in?
right?
Oh, that's funny. You want me to redo the last sentence?
That'll still
And then
be
have
in
that
the
other
outtakes
thing in
no
the
matter what.
outtakes?
Sure.
Edgy commentary on the dangers of doctrine, the foibles of faith, the bullshit of belief, the stupidity of superstition, and the idiocy of indoctrination.
All right, I mixed a drink. It's Monday night. Let's party. Let's do this. Something tells me I'm probably going to need booze for this, so let's go.
With razor-sharp wit, curiosity, and critical thought, we take an unblinking look at today's religions. We are Atheist Edge.